Aloha and welcome to UH Manoa. My name is Jonathan Pettit from the Department of Religions and Ancient Civilizations. We're here today. The Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa aims to foster interdisciplinary understanding of mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and other Chinese-speaking societies worldwide, as well as of Chinese civilization and its long connections to Hawaii. This webinar series, open and free for all, is one of the center's main conduits to engage with scholars in Chinese studies worldwide. So today we have two speakers, each speak about 20 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. You'll note that there's a Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom infrastructure that you can use for questions. So as our speakers are talking, feel free to ask those questions. And we can bring it into the Q&A session. So don't wait to the very end, please. If you have logistical issues or other kind of problems, there's also a chat button that you can use to ask questions, and we'll put more information in the chat as well. So before we begin, I want to take this time to acknowledge the director of the Center for Chinese Studies, Dr. Mingbao Yu, Associate Director Ni Zhang, and Assistant Adriana Choi. So it's through their tireless efforts in hosting and promoting this webinar that we can all be here today. So today's webinar, Transparency and Projection in Medieval Buddhist Scripture, brings together Dr. Kate Lingley and Michael Norton. Kate Lingley is an Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her research focuses on Buddhist votive sculpture of the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, with a particular interest in the social history of religious art in medieval China. She is currently working on a book manuscript on the lives of Buddhist women in medieval China, as seen through the votive monuments they dedicated, and an edited collection on the epigraphic evidence for women's roles in early Buddhism across Asia. Michael Norton is a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at Harvard University. He earned his MA from Tsinghua University 2019, where he studied Chinese Buddhist art and archaeology of the Northern and Southern dynasties. He received his BA in Chinese language and Asian studies with a minor in art history from Vassar College in 2014. His research addresses Buddhist cosmological imagery, ecological themes in sculpture and painting, and visual depictions of sound and acoustic motifs. So with that, I will pass the mic to Dr. Kate Lingley.
And thank you all for being here. I just wanted to give a little bit of a frame to what we're doing here. So Michael and I had met before this, but this kind of conversation arose out of our presentations at the AAS conference about a year ago, in which we basically noticed that our two projects, two kind of works in progress, had really interesting resonances with each other and seemed to both kind of revolve around the questions of materiality of stone and the and certain visualization approaches to visualization that seem to kind of contradict the materiality of stone. And so we talked about maybe doing something collaboratively, and life kind of got in the way. And so finally here we are. And so what I'd like to do today is to ask Michael to give a brief presentation of his project, which is in progress, and I'll give mine. And then he and I will have about a 10-minute just back and forth about where we see the overlap between our projects and the kind of ways in which these feed into each other. And then we really invite what questions anyone may have. So without wasting any more time, I think we should hand it over to Michael to show his work.
All right. First, thank you, Kate, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you today. And thank you to the staff of the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, for all of your work in organizing. If I turn on my PowerPoint, we can see, yeah? Awesome. All right, so I'll get started. So my presentation today is entitled Tented Architecture, Luminous Projections, and the Five Tanyao Caves. And it comes from my dissertation currently in progress, so I welcome all feedback on the kind of directions of this chapter and look forward to questions later in the talk today. Despite being the centermost of the 5 Tanyao caves, Yungang Cave 18 discloses little of its contents from the exterior, only the face and upper torso of the primary statue visible from the clerestory window located above the roughly hewn entrance portal. Closer inspection of the monumental colossus upon entry into the cave interior, however, reveals the presence of one iconographic motif that was deployed to signify the figure's status as a multidimensional cosmic being, namely dozens upon dozens of transformation Buddhas or Huafu that radiate across the figure's monastic robes. Carved between the pleats created by these drapery folds are tightly wound whirlpools that coalesce into numinous tendrils of vapor that then appear to morph gradually and in stepwise fashion into corporal forms. To the right, I show one intermediary stage where figures emerge out of flower blossoms, and eventually these complete their transformation into fully realized figures that are seated in meditation. As observed by the Japanese scholar Yoshimura Rei, the robes of the Cave 18 standing Buddha seem to outline a gradual process of development, one that begins as spiral cloud forms near the figure's collar that I've highlighted here, and then ultimately culminates in the final 2 stages that I previously introduced. For me, this raises the question of what we should do with these luminous bodies that transform and radiate outward from this central figure. Historically, the canonically understood meanings of both the sculptural program in Cave 18 and the 5 Tanyao caves at Yungang more broadly have remained largely static. And according to this orthodox account, the caves represent the ruling dynasty's emperors as enlightened beings, each of the primary icons, one in each of the 5 cave shrines, acting as a type of portrait sculpture of various members of the ancestral line of the Northern Wei imperial house. Archaeologically, its program is seen as a natural result of iconographic transmission from Gandhara in northwestern Pakistan through Central Asia and along the Silk Roads and eventually into northern China. I break with this scholarly tradition slightly to tell a different story about the object as a luminous body. Close observation of the Cave 18 standing Buddha reveals several key formal conceits that appear to contend specifically with the issue of representing miraculous radiance and luminosity. And it's these attempts to sculpturally negotiate and represent optical effects that I think offer novel ways to read and see the 5 Tanyao caves specifically. Now, the monumental standing statue consists of no fewer than 3 interrelated faces. These are integrated in the sculpture themselves, but there's something that we're able to parse out mentally when we consider how the composition is constructed. And this consists of the body, the Buddha's physical body itself, shown at the far left, the garment that's draped over him at center, and then the radiating transformation Buddhas that I discussed earlier. The interaction between these seemingly discrete layers points to, I think, an intentionally irresolvable tension in the optical performance of the devotional image. So on one hand, the divine bodies of the transformation Buddhas can be seen as appearing on top of an opaque garment. The monastic robe functions like a screen that displays the miraculous visualization. And so in this instance, we have projection onto a surface. On the other hand, we have various canonical sources and apocryphal sources as well that describe how the Buddha's manifestations of multiple bodies and transformation Buddhas are external emanations. So they're luminous visions that extend from the body of the enlightened being. So projecting outward and then emerge through the monastic robe. And indeed, although there are no Buddhas on the actual body of the statue itself, the Huafu, these transformation bodies, appear to evolve as they emerge through the garment. So less developed forms appear closer to the body or on what would be the underside of the garment and then proceed to their final stage on the outermost layer. Consequently, there exists an inherent paradox in the visual programming of the central icon of Yungang Cave 18 that engages with an awareness of both material opacity and the imagined translucency of rock. Using the seemingly self-contradictory visuality of this opaque transparency and transparent opacity as a starting point, I offer 3 frameworks that I think all operate simultaneously to understand the monument and the sculptural program as it behaves in the 5 Tanyao caves, specifically materiality, translucency, and topography. And I'll walk through all of these and give a brief introduction as how I see this happening. So first, materiality. So the Yungang caves are, of course, excavated from a rocky cliff face, but there are other types of material imaginary at play in the repertoire of the Northern Way and the Buddhists who were producing images during the middle of the 5th century, specifically semi-permanent construction techniques, or tents, and hence the icon of choice. So although the Tanyo caves look very similar formally to examples of cave shrines that we see in Central and South Asia, the architectural footprints of the plan that I show below here point to an origin that seems to be formally independent of rock-cut structures seen in other parts of the Buddhist world, a peculiarity that has been acknowledged by several Chinese architectural historians and archaeologists, including Su Bai and Liang Sicheng. In fact, most recently, scholars have even gone so far as to say that the caves take the forms of tented architecture used by the Northern Way as their primary precedent, at least in terms of the shape of the footprint. Discovered in Yanbei Shiyuan tomb complex outside the modern city of Datong, so right by the Yungang caves. Several small clay funerary sculptures offer a glimpse into what these structures may have looked like. And if we highlight the footprints, specifically, they seem to be drawing directly from these tented structures. It's hard to find an image of the tent on the left in profile, but it has a similar kind of horseshoe-shaped construction. Additionally, beyond these formal similarities of footprint, the facades of the cave seem to also perhaps be borrowing from some of the effects of tented architecture, namely the primary statues being visible through a clerestory opening in rock, but that parallels what would have been a ventilation structure in tented architectural forms. Now, despite the limited supply of archaeological examples, textual documentation of these building types and other tented structures used by Buddhist practitioners all describe the way in which devotional icons would have been enshrined in buildings made of fabric. For example, one renowned monastic, Fa Xian, wrote in his 4th century travelogue that in one Central Asian state, statues would be paraded into the city on sumptuously decorated 4-wheeled image carriages. And these carts were said to have been shaped like moving palaces constructed out of silk banners and flags that descended from a canopy structure above, a practice that eventually found its way to the capital cities of the Northern Way. We know this from other historic documents. Now, given the centrality of the tent as the primary building type of the Northern Way, the primary ethnic group during this period, it's perhaps unsurprising then that the behaviors of tented structures and cloth would become inflected into the rock-cut construction that we see at Yungang. By referencing tented architecture, Northern Way sculptors recast, I think, stone as fabric. And in so doing, they didn't merely borrow an extant plan type, but imbued the rock from which the chapel had been excavated with the physical and material properties of a textile, namely the ability to be translucent. By this period, in addition to the architectural precedents that the monument may have drawn from, there also existed a variety of texts that dealt with visualization practices, meditation techniques, and other instructions that involved mentally recalling and invoking the radiant form of the Buddha. And I think these as well are also at play in the program. So as I noted when I introduced the main icon of Yungang Cave 18, the figure is covered with or emits myriad transforming Buddhas that radiate down along the cascading folds of the figure's drapery. These infinite luminous bodies then proceed to populate the walls of the entire chapel, as if they've been projected outward from the centermost colossus. This active multiplication doesn't end there, as these forms appear to pass or phase through the cliff itself into the interiors of Cave 17 and 18, which are immediately adjacent to it, and onward to Cave 16. The superficial walls of Cave 20 collapsed probably shortly after its completion, but there's still trace evidence that suggests the motif may have been continued there as well, at least in the top corner of what is still extant now. As such, rather than viewing each of the 5 Tanyo caves as discrete units, each adjacent cave to the east and west of the central space of 18 acts as another radiant node that allows the sculptural emanation to continue moving outward in all directions. And so it unites all of the spaces together. Now, by sublimating the material attribute of translucency, as would have been seen in textile-based counterparts, the architecture of the Tanya caves could deploy representation of luminous bodies to reject outright the opacity of stone. This is not at all far-fetched, a far-fetched reading of what statues might do during this period, as we have contemporaneous religious texts which offer ample description of the miraculous powers attributed to plastic form in China's early medieval period, as well as instructions on how to visualize standing statuary. By way of one example that I show here, taken from the record of the monasteries at Luoyang, it's recorded that a statue was discovered underground specifically due to its ability to produce miraculous light, and a radiance of 5 colors shone within the hall, and their brilliance was extraordinary, emanating from underground, so again, through earth. This is by no means the only reference to light-emitting sacred images. It's a property of statuary that seems to have been largely commonplace in the early medieval imagination. And so as such, I think it's reasonable to assume to some degree that the monumental sculptures of the Tanyao caves were probably viewed as being capable of similar feats of divine effulgence. At the same time, Buddhist visualization literature teaches the reader methods that allow for the mental projection of standing statues. According to one meditative procedure from the Guangfu Sanmei Haijing, the practitioner must imagine a standing icon with exacting precision from head to toe before mentally applying the number of fingers in the vision to fill an entire room or several rooms over. The steps of the visualization also say that the transformation bodies, these myriad forms that radiate across the sculpture, will undergo a process referred to as the 18 transformations. Early sources from the period disagree about what these specific transformations and changes were, and they're not codified until later after the Northern Way, but early lists from the 4th and 5th centuries say that they include acts of expansion, contraction, and multiplication, miracles that seem to some degree correspond with the size, shape, and stage of development of the emanation Buddhas that we see on the main icon of Cave 18 as well. None of this is to say that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the descriptions of statues emanating light found in historical sources, or that the cave is a perfect duplication of an optical phenomenon described in visualization texts. Merely, the site was created during an era when not only were statues ascribed these miraculous powers of light production, but that the envisioning of myriad transformation bodies was a sign of an efficacious meditative practice and general mental cultivation. So in some ways, it's as if the program draws from all of these different reference points and becomes something that's self-replicating. The statue forever giving off Buddhas that in turn could generate more Buddhas. But to what end? So I've laid out what the program does, but why do we need these kind of complicated optical theatrics of light that are happening across the monument? And I think the answer perhaps comes from when we turn to topography, the last of the 3 sort of frameworks I think help us understand the monument. Specifically, I want us to reconsider what we think of when we refer to Buddhist cave shrines, at least with respect to the Tanyao caves, because there's a specific reference point that comes from the timeline of their construction that I think historically has been overlooked. Conventionally, the history of Yungang is recounted as follows. In the year 445 of the Common Era, the Northern Wei Emperor Taiwu formally outlawed the practice of Buddhism, believing that devotees of the faith had attempted a revolution, and he's looking to oust them and remove them from power. Although the imperial decree ushered in a period characterized by intense iconoclasm and covert religious practice, just 7 years after these anti-Buddhist policies, Taiwu's successor Wencheng restored the legality of the foreign religion and then initiated the construction of 5 monumental sculptures housed in rock-cut chapels on a cliff face outside of his capital city, sometime around the year 460, under the auspices of the monk Tanyao, hence the name. I think one other event about caves should be added to this timeline that happens in the year 443. That year, a bannerman from the state of Wuloho, the ancestral homeland of Emperor Taiwu, arrived at court to offer tribute. The visitor recounting that the ancestral temples of the Northern Wei were still active sites of worship as in the days of old, the local population frequently making offerings there that were said to be efficacious. The revelation would lead Emperor Taiwu to dispatch one of his ministers to search for this site and perform ritual offerings there on his behalf. This emissary is believed to have been successful and made the trek to what is now the Gaxiandong, or the Gaxian Cave in Inner Mongolia. And according to legend, this was the divine point of origin out of which the Northern Wei were born into the world. And by dispatching representatives of his court to this distant land, Taiwu ostensibly brought it within the limits of his political authority. The text in this natural cave that he had his emissary carve a trace of his power and the extent of his reach. Although largely identical with the received textual record, the inscription that archaeologists uncovered in the 20th century found at this naturally occurring cave differs markedly in one small aspect from what is received in the official histories of the Northern Wei. The text described Emperor Taiwu's kingdom as explicitly Taoist, a religious tradition local to China and something that he adopted towards the later years of his reign. That the emissary dispatched here would ostensibly claim the ancestral cave in the name of a self-proclaimed Taoist emperor makes the construction of Buddhist caves at Yungang under the auspices of Wencheng, the successor, diametrically opposed to the acts of Taiwu and iconoclasm. Whereas Emperor Taiwu, the iconoclast, used textual inscription in a natural cave geographically removed from his empire to cast himself and his legacy and his state in Taoist terms, Wencheng, who would have been familiar with this legend of the Gaxian cave and Taiwu's efforts to claim it, used images in his own man-made structures immediately adjacent to his capital to imagine his world as a renewed Buddhist state. Consequently, the entire monument was not just a response to an emperor and his sanctioned iconoclasm, but the shrines were a fundamental negation of all of these acts. And it's then this scenario that makes earlier attempts to read the Tanyo caves and their primary icons as representatives of specific nameable persons, all but antithetical, I think, to the aims of the monument. If the Tanyo caves serve to fully deny the destruction of representation, then the grotto shrines must make that which they've represented indestructible. And the act of specifically naming something guarantees that you can locate it in space, find it, and then later destroy it. Instead, all aspects of the monument attempt to destabilize any material fixity that might enable it to be destroyed again. So something that's ideologically central to the goals of the first massive commission of Buddhist art after a sustained period of the destruction of images. And at its most formal level, the central icon is both transparent and opaque, a material obfuscation that enables the program to escape conventional notions of vision. Materially, it's a cave that guises itself with the formal conceits of fabric in order to subvert the limited affordances of stone and thereby allow the program to transcend its state as something that's attached and affixed to solid matter. This then integrates period-specific discussions on the effulgent properties of statuary, as well as descriptions of visionary experience that, when used to inform the sculptural program, create something that visually performs an act of luminescent self-replication. Read in this way, we can see that the monument puts forth a challenge to all subsequent viewers. How can you saying something that I think to the effect is how can you possibly destroy us? We're multiplying ourselves before your very eyes, and we're made of light. We're literally intangible and can phase through all types of matter. Topographically, the selection and manufacture of the site as a cave then worked to wholly undermine the actions of an iconoclastic ruler and create a new space for a Buddhist one. In viewing the Tanyo caves through these three frameworks simultaneously, it can be seen that almost every aspect of its construction, the site was not only a solution to the preceding period of iconoclasm, but also the ultimate defense against the future destruction of images. The employment of cosmic form enabling these dual processes of remediation and protection to happen simultaneously. Although hewn from stone, the grotto shrines were defined and governed by the material properties of fabric and light. In mobilizing this program, Wencheng ensured that not only would his kingdom be remembered in perpetuity as a Buddhist one, but that its icons and images would remain forever luminous and, by extension, indestructible. That's all I've got for today. turn that over
Thank
to
you,
Kate.
Michael.
Well, thank you.
So this is really interesting stuff, and I'm going to present my own. So we're both kind of presenting work in progress. I'm going to present my own work in progress, and then maybe we can talk about the places that they speak to each other. So I am going to share my screen. Hang on a second. Think. Okay, that look okay? Everybody can see my little smiley Buddha? Great. Right. Okay, so thank you again. Michael has talked about the Tanyao caves at Yungang, which are imperially sponsored large-scale cave sites, which are sort of one end of the spectrum of early medieval Buddhist sculpture. And I'm kind of at the other end here because I'm here today to advocate for the discursive value of small-scale Buddhist monuments, such as this one, which is about 2.5 feet high and carved from stones. It's a freestanding Buddha. It would have probably had a tang on the bottom and had a kind of a pedestal, but other than that, otherwise it stands as high as it ever stood. So beyond the large-scale imperially sponsored cave temples, there are thousands and thousands of smaller freestanding monuments sponsored by otherwise unknown donors and housed quite unsystematically among museum collections around the world, and thus easily overlooked. This one is in the collection of the Rietberg Museum in Zurich, where it was collected in the early 20th century by a industry baron of Swiss extraction. But I think some of these smaller scale examples don't get a lot of individual attention, but I think therein, in some sense, lies their value in that they're very, very diverse, and each represents in its own way a specific and concrete artistic and religious solution to a devotional problem in early medieval Buddhism. So here we have this one is sort of particularly delightful because its face survives, which a lot of them don't. This Buddha is sculpted in relief so high that he's practically carved in the round. And the flat plane attached to his back represents his mandorla, which is basically a kind of a body halo. And it's a little hard to see here, but he does have a smaller kind of round head halo. We'll talk about that in a minute. Images like this one may have been part of the collection of votive images installed in a temple, or may have been used for private devotion on a domestic altar or in a roadside shrine. They are probably a variety of uses for images at this scale. And like all Buddha images, they are indexical in that they render an absent subject present. Buddha images bring the Buddha's presence into the human realm. And this one's three-dimensionality makes it especially effective. It's smaller than life size, but it's not, nevertheless kind of emerges into the world of the devotee. And a lot of inscriptions on this kind of image suggest that this was seen as a remedy for the actual Buddha's absence from the world after his nirvana. And there are some interesting points there that I hope to come back to because something I've been writing about in another context, a lot of this, the claims that are made in inscriptions on some of these monuments suggest that the permanence and durability of stone was valued precisely for its ability to kind of withstand one of the things that we otherwise think of as a fundamental insight of, which is to say the fundamental impermanence of the material world and the absence of the Buddha from the world. So there is frequently some tension between that. So I've described a kind of simple indexicality by which the Buddha is brought into the presence of the viewer. But there's frequently some tension between that and a more complicated and multivalent representation of spaces, times, and narrative. So for example, here is a stele, right? So kind of standing stone tablet dedicated by a group of 90 lay and monastic donors. Donors are kind of my shtick, and so this is interesting in a lot of ways. But I present it here as a kind of example of a type of monument which is sort of visually and representationally complex. It is not intended as a sort of a simple representation of a figure, but rather here's a closer view. You can see that it is visually symmetrical, but contains a number of different images. There's a seated Buddha, flanked by 2 disciples and 2 bodhisattvas. Below him is a kind of elaborated incense burner with lotus blossoms. There are two lions. There's a great history, great kind of tradition in Chinese Buddhist sculpture of lions as sculpted by people who have never seen a lion. Here are some guardian figures. It's got Lokapalas or Dvarapalas, depending on how you think about them. There are some nice little dragons up here. The dragon in Chinese Buddhist visual culture kind of stands in for the Naga in the Indic context. There's a separate image up here of the famous debate between Vimalakirti and Manjushri, and then the top of the stele is elaborated into the form of this double dragon, which is a kind of ornamental detail which is taken from earlier, even pre-Buddhist stele, which had this kind of dragon top. I wanted to run through this quickly because what we're not looking at a kind of solely kind of mimetic representation here, right? So the Buddha sitting in his little niche is maybe understood as occupying the same space as his attendants. And maybe we can understand the guardians, the lions, and the incense burner as being kind of in front of the seated Buddha. But on the other hand, the debate between Vimalakirti and Manjushri comes from a completely different kind of narrative, and I think would have been seen by any observer at the time as representing a totally different space. This is just happening somewhere else. And nobody is, I think, imagining, for example, that Vimalakirti and Manjushri are having their debate underneath a canopy made of dragons, right? So this is kind of a decorative element. So in other words, a lot of monuments are visually complex and don't necessarily represent a kind of coherent single visual space. So there's a lot of complexities to representations, to these kinds of representations in the 6th century. So returning to our figure from the Rietberg Museum, I wanted to show you a bit of a detail of the left-hand side of the Buddha. I should say that when we talk about left and right in Buddhist art, we're almost always speaking from the point of view of the Buddha figure itself. So this is the Buddha's left hand, right? This is a bodhisattva standing on the Buddha's left. It is entirely conventional for a Buddhist sculpture of, in actually most periods in Chinese Buddhist art, to be flanked by bodhisattvas, right? So another kind of enlightened being. And we sort of imagine this as like the Buddha with his attendants. But what's interesting in this case is that while the Buddha is sculpted in 3 dimensions, the bodhisattvas who are notionally accompanying him, right, in this occupying the same space, are engraved in on the back of the mandorla in a completely different representational mode, right? They're executed in this line engraving, very fine and delicate and quite beautiful, and quite characteristic of like the first third of the 6th century. So I should have pointed out this sculpture is probably about 60 years later than the caves we just were talking about. But anyway, this kind of very beautiful line engraving style. And there's another bodhisattva on the other side, which is executed in the same way. So what's going on here representationally, right? How do we, if we think that the purpose of this Buddha sculpture is to bring a kind of physical Buddha into the presence of the worshiper, then how come the bodhisattvas that accompany him are not also 3-dimensional, right? What is going on in this example? And to start trying to explain it, I actually am going to turn to not Buddhist but funerary art, and it's worth pointing out, by the way, that this is this which I'm about to explain is roughly contemporary, right? This is an artwork which is roughly contemporary, but in general, there is a kind of notional separation between Buddhist art and funerary art in the early medieval period. So among the artworks produced in and around the Northern Wei capital of Luoyang in the first third of the 6th century is a body of stone carvings that use a line engraving technique to depict quite complex pictorial images on flat stone surfaces. And the most famous examples of these are a series of sarcophagi decorated with images from the Han literature on filial piety. So this detail illustrates the story of the filial son Guoju, who is identified with a little inscription up here. These line engraved images have been demonstrated to reflect a fundamental change in the representational language of 2-dimensional Chinese art. In his 1990 article, The Transparent Stone, Hong calls this approach binary imagery. These images represent a three-dimensional space receding away from the picture plane, but the technique for doing so is not a technique of optical perspective. Rather, it's the positioning and movement of figures in space in such a way that their implicit movement is either toward or away from the picture plane, so into or out of the scene. You can kind of see that happening in this story, which unfolds in kind of four scenes, although one scene does double duty, where Guoju and his wife are taking care of Guoju's mother, and they're facing kind of into the scene, and then they come out of the scene and are kneeling here in the foreground with their child, and then they find a pot of gold, which is going to enable them to take care of the mother instead of having to bury the child alive, which is sort of, it's a bit of a terrifying story, but anyway, right, so they're facing into the scene here, and then they are returning with the pot of gold, and they're facing out of the scene. They're kind of emerging back into this space. So there's a kind of a circular movement, right? They bring the gold back to the mother. Everybody lives happily ever after. There's a kind of movement into and out of the scene, which is what is doing the work of creating the pictorial space. So this is a mode of the picture surface, which is a flat plane of stone, is reimagined here as a transparent window through which we observe figures whose movement toward or away from us creates the notional space behind the transparent stone. So it's a mode of two-dimensional representation, which treats a flat stone surface as a window-like plane through which images can be viewed, rather than a matrix from which images emerge. And Hong further points out a tendency of some of these artworks to call attention to the materiality of the picture plane by interrupting it with details that break the illusionism, such as the cartouche here, right? So an inscription hanging in midair reminds us that what we're looking at is a representation and not a reality. So this suggests that artists of the time not only used binary imagery, so-called, to create a sense of recession in pictorial space, but that they actively emphasized the illusory and artificial nature of this representational system. In his article, Wu Hong ties the idea of binary imagery and the concept of the transparent stone to new and radical ideas about art and representation being framed in the aesthetic theory of the period. Theories which mainly addressed painting and focused on illusionism. As he points out, and this is a quote, the relationship between seeing and imagining, or between eyes and mind, became a central topic of art criticism at the time. It seems likely that the imaginative leap that turned opaque stone into a transparent and permeable surface might also have been seen as appropriate for visualizing the world of Buddhism. So the same post-Han period, which produced the first surviving works of art theory and criticism in Chinese history, was also the period of Buddhism's first flowering in China. And Wu Hong's argument about binary imagery was developed by exclusive reference to funerary art of the early 6th century, but there are certainly examples of Buddhist art which adopt the same approach to the representation of space. And one of them is the backside of this stele. So honestly, this is an interesting stele for all kinds of reasons, but one of which is that it has this front side, which is very fairly deep relief carving, and the backside, which is done entirely in line engraving, such that a photograph of it in the in situ, right, in the museum, completely fails to convey any information. So what I'm showing you here is an ink rubbing of this back surface that captures the pictorial elements. And they're all executed in that fine line engraving, right? And these images are a number of images representing scenes from the life of the Buddha, in which figures are arranged in similar landscape settings that recede to distant mountains. Architectural structures and furniture are angled to indicate recession in space. Here's a close-up of one section, right? Figures like this apsaras swoop in dramatically from, in this case, from the upper left, right? Flying from the background toward the picture plane. These scenes have the same dynamic and playful sense of a real space viewed through a transparent plane, as we see in the filial piety sarcophagi. So this too is a transparent stone. It invites us to look into the world of the Buddha's birth and path to enlightenment as though we gaze through a window. And I want to add that we shouldn't be totally surprised by this, given that it seems likely that some of the same artisans were probably involved in making both of these kinds of images. And we don't have any particular reason to suspect that there was a kind of separation between them. And in fact, there are really interesting kind of areas of overlap that suggest otherwise. So these line engraved scenes on the back of the stele seem entirely unconnected to the images carved on the front of the stele, right? They have their own spatial logic, which is totally separate. It's even separate from these two relief figures of Shakyamuni and Prabhudaratna, who are carved immediately above them in the head of the stele, right? So when we look at an example like this one, the matter seems simple enough, right? Different representational spaces are rendered using different sculptural modes. But that simplicity and consistency aren't actually sustained from one monument to the next. So, or even sometimes from one part of the same monument to another. So it's not like we can identify a sort of a systematic rule, like when do you use line engraving? When do you use sculptural relief? It's impossible to sort of fully define a particular rule for how this is used. And in fact, we have all these quite interesting examples in which different kinds of representational modes or sculptural modes are being used not only on the same monument, but apparently to indicate figures that occupy the same sort of notional space. So what do we make of this, right? If the kind of effect of high relief and sculpture in the round is to render the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas kind of present in the devotee's own space, and the function of line engraved imagery is to provide the devotee with a window into kind of a visionary space beyond, then what do we make of a Buddha who is so physically present, yet attended by Bodhisattvas who are only glimpsed beyond a transparent stone surface? There's something complicated going on here, right? There's a kind of visual push-pull effect in which sculpted figures enter into the viewer's own space, while other images invite the viewer to gaze beyond the surface of a stone made permeable. I would like to suggest that this inconsistency, or perhaps better, this dynamism, actually reflects the complexity and multivalency of the spaces and figures described in popular Buddhist literature, which the devotee was invited to visualize through meditative practice and recitation. And we've already had some quotes from visualization sutras in Michael's presentation, and which the artisan was required to represent. And I'd like to suggest that this presents an artistic challenge. The fluidity of representation is perhaps actually a result of the attempt to visualize spaces and figures which are themselves understood to be dynamic and inconsistent, and perhaps even illusory, although in a meaningful way. Ideas of binary imagery and the transparent stone are in some sense a better fit for this kind of visionary experience than they are for the representation of real spaces. David McMahon has written extensively about the sense of sight as a primary metaphor for knowledge and awakening in the Mahayana literature in his book, Empty Vision. In his account, the sense of sight is active and dynamic, granting the ability of the devotee not just to see, but also to visualize things which are true, but not directly accessible to ordinary sight. This is particularly true of the so-called visualization sutras, such as the Visualization Sutra of Amitayus, which contains a series of 16 visualization exercises aimed at building up, step by step, a visual image of an impossible paradise. The goal of such visualization, in a practical sense, is to visualize oneself into the Western Pure Land, which is, in its way, something like seeing through and ultimately passing through the surface of stone into a fictive space. And I should say, by the way, that devotees who are reborn in the Western Pure Land are reborn and manifest within lotus blossoms, which is something that we also just saw on the surface of the Tanyao Buddha. In any event, in order to do this, the devotee has to find a way to visualize something which is actually far beyond the limits of ordinary visual and spatial experience, right? So here's just a brief quotation from one of the visualization exercises, right? Each golden bannered pillar has 8 corners and 8 sides. Each side is made of 100 jewels. Each jewel shines with 1,000 rays of light, and each ray of light has 84,000 colors. Right? Try to imagine visualizing, right? Making a really taking an honest crack at visualizing that, right? The literature is full of descriptions like this, manifestations as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, spaces opening up into infinity, time stretching beyond imagination. Metaphors of multiplicity and infinity are everywhere, which the devotee is invited to perceive through the active engagement of the visual and spatial senses. So too are metaphors of illusion and spontaneous manifestation. So popular sutras are full of parables like the illusory city from the Lotus Sutra, in which real spaces and places prove to be visions or imaginary tools of expedient means. Buddhist miracle tales are full of man-made sculptures which nevertheless move, act, and have agency, and emit light and cry out from under the ground. There is likely a still further connection to be made in the Zhiguai literature, the literature on strange occurrences, which is full of dream visions and manifestations. I haven't had time to go down that rabbit hole yet, but imagine yourself as an artist in the early years of the development of Chinese Buddhist art. How are you to represent such fluidity? Interestingly, there's some more recent work. This has now come up since I made this presentation a year ago. More recent work by Anne Feng, or I should say actually that I became aware of this article since then. More recent work by Anne Feng has investigated metaphors of transparency and the imagination of a transparent pictorial space as connected to relics and reliquaries of the Sui Tang period. So that's a little bit later, kind of from the 590s into the 7th, so the last decade of the 6th into the 7th century. Although this is slightly later than my material, I think it has relevance. In particular, she recounts miracle tales in which stone reliquary caskets, made to contain the holy remains of a Buddha, become transparent, revealing what they contain to the outside. Several of the texts she cites describe the inside and the outside as being literally connected, as though the intervening stone had dissolved or become transparent. At least one surviving reliquary casket from the first decade of the 7th century is decorated with line-engraved figures representing miracles connected with the appearance of relics. And this is just the illustration from Anne's article, which I just screenshotted, so I have ganked it quite directly from her. And this is, I think, where the Rietberg Buddha can actually help make sense of things, because I think the key to this interpretive move, at least in the case of the images I'm working on, is the nature of the Buddha's mandorla. The mandorla and the halo are consistent artistic problems in the art of Chinese Buddhism. They're physical representations of an emanation of light around the body, that is the mandorla, or the head, the halo, of a holy figure. In the case of a standing frontally posed figure, the artist can represent them as flat planes that adhere to the back of the figure's body and head, respectively, which is what's going on in our own sculpture here. But as soon as a figure begins to turn in space, the artist is faced with a problem. Does the halo turn too, like a plate stuck to the back of the figure's head, right? In this case, this is a 6th century cave at Dunhuang in which the artist decided that's exactly what happens. And it's part of a kind of wonderful subclass of images, which I think really reveal the challenges of artists wrestling with developing representational conventions for a new tradition. So mandorlas are even more complicated because some texts describe the spontaneous appearance of miniature Buddhas or other visions that manifest within the nimbus of light. And that is related to the Nirmanakaya Buddhas, the Hua Shenfuo, that appeared on the body of the Tanyao Buddha. So the mandorla is both an emanation of light and a source of visions. Artists of the time working in stone had a toolkit that included the use of sculpture in the round and the use of high relief, which brought figures like the Buddha into the devotee's space through plain mimesis, but may have been inadequate to represent the visual ambiguity and illusionism of the Buddhist imaginary, a problem for which the paradoxical nature of the transparent stone seems to have offered a powerful solution. It's possible that this forms the root of the artistic ideas that underlie the tales of miraculously transparent stone reliquaries 100 years later. Anne Feng's position in her own article is that it was the influx of transparent materials like rock crystal and glass that enabled what she calls a, quote, new turn in the development of pictorial space. But I'd like to suggest that the roots of the idea of the transparent stone were already in place in the Buddhist art tradition 100 years earlier. So I think that this gives us, and just a few other examples of the same phenomenon, right? I focused on the Rietberg sculpture. Here's one in a museum in Frankfurt, which does very much the same thing, right? These are sculptures which, of a type which might, in other contexts, actually have three-dimensional bodhisattvas, but where here they're being engraved on the mandorla, and up at the top is a stupa. There's other figures flying apsaras and so on, which in other cases of sculptures from the same time and place might well have been sculpted in 3 dimensions, right? You can do it this way, but for which the 2-dimensional nature of line engraving seems also to have been a really effective solution.
I'm sorry, my earphone just died. Okay, I apologize. I'm now using my computer microphone, which is not as good, but I'm not sure what the deal is with my earphone. Anyway, okay. So I think what's interesting to me here is, okay, so this is the end of my presentation, and I'll stop sharing my screen here and just say, if I can, there we go. Okay. And invite Michael to join me in maybe about 5 or 10 minutes of conversation, and then open up the Q&A. I'll just start out by saying that this is the initial, when I sat through your paper and then gave my own paper at the conference, what really struck me was that there are some really fundamentally complicated and funky things happening around the materiality of stone.
Exactly.
In both of
Yeah.
probably in the case of the materials that Anne Fung is working on as well, where stone, we know that Buddhist sculptures were made of a lot of different materials. We have kind of historical records that suggest you've got silk, you've got paper, you've got wood, dry lacquer, ivory, unfired clay, fired clay, right? We actually have a few surviving ceramic images, gilt bronze, but the vast majority of surviving images are in stone, I think precisely because of its durability. So we think of stone as fundamentally a material that is permanent and solid and durable. And there's a lot of old ideas, very long-running ideas that that are precisely about this. You have people inscribing texts on stone to prevent them from being lost. This predates Buddhism, actually, and it's done with the Confucian classics at first, and then later it's also done with Buddhist sutras. So the kind of core metaphor of stone seems to be one of solidity and permanence and durability, which is interesting given Buddhist ideas about impermanence. But here we see it being treated as fabric, as translucent, as projection, as projective, as kind of opening up, as kind of a surface through which we can see into a fictive space. And so for my money, I feel like the issue around which all of these phenomena are revolving is kind of the materiality of stone. And I wonder how you feel about that, Michael.
One, I think fundamentally funky is what I'm going to start using to refer to the phenomenon as. But I mean, for me, in listening to your talk and thinking about the later examples that you introduced from Anne Fung's work, I tie this sort of exploration that happens with the materiality of stone and what it's capable of doing, specifically to the fact that Buddhism is, during this, especially this earlier period, is introducing a lot of new ways to think about cosmology, reality, and consequently the materials that you surround yourself with. And I think naturally, on multiple levels, that the introduction of those kind of ideologies is going to ask you to reconsider what you think of as a conventional property of really anything. And I think Buddhist parables time and time again ask us to reconsider the permanency of the physical body, the very one thing we thought was a stable construction. And when your kind of baseline is like, well, maybe let's reconsider that notion, I think that naturally can then extend into the world of artistic and visual production, where if my body is not even something that I should take as a kind of stable entity with properties that I understand it to have, then maybe stone can do a lot more. So part of me thinks, and I wonder too, when you raise the question of, or the archaeological record gives us a lot of stone, and then it gives us descriptions of other materials. I wonder too, if, especially during this earlier period where things are really experimental, if the forms that we haven't survived and we don't really know how to interpret them beyond their textual descriptions, if they're also not playing with the expectations of the materials they're made out of in really interesting ways. I wonder, you know, what you could do to out of an icon made out of wood that rejects its woodiness, if you will, in the same way that these cases take stone and say, yeah, we know what stone can do. I'm going to show you that it can do more than what you think it can do, if that makes sense. So those are my first kind of initial musings about this relationship to new ideas about cosmology, how they relate to material. And then I guess throwing out then another hypothetical of part of me does probably think that it's very likely that these examples and other materials we don't have access to are probably also experimenting with the boundaries of what the material affordances are. We just don't have the record to confirm that, but I think we see it so ubiquitously through stone, right? You've got ways it can be transparent, it can be a plane that you can punch through, it can have things come out of it, you can move in it. None of that is how solids behave, but suddenly we're totally fine with that. I imagine you're going to be seeing similar things across materials. So those are my first initial musings.
Yeah, and we're never, you know, there's some of those questions are never going to be answerable because we don't have the actual objects that survive, although we do have some interesting descriptions, like, you know, there's a few places like Boxing County in Shandong where there have been caches of sculpture excavated that include both stone sculpture, bronze, gilt bronze sculpture, and ceramic, like bisque-fired white ceramic Buddhas. All kind of made around the same time and in the same place. And that's sort of looking at them, trying to compare them might be an interesting mode, an interesting way into that. Bronze, of course, is also durable, but you can recycle it, right? So, and in fact, when I was looking into this at one point, I found, I'll have to go and find the source again, but I found a story about a bronze Buddha that was cast by a bunch of donors and who all contributed coins to provide the bronze. And so then when the Buddha was cast, there were still coins visible in one of the folds of its garment, like they hadn't totally melted or something, which I thought was a really fascinating detail about sort of the way in which a Buddha sculpture might admit of its own materiality, right? Like this, like I am made of coins. Of course, that's the whole problem. That's why Buddhism keeps getting slapped down. It's like too many coins are becoming Buddhas. But that's a separate problem. So yeah, I think there are a lot of really interesting questions about material and materiality to be asked here. And so maybe we've come up to 1 o'clock. Shall we open the floor for Q&A questions and whatnot?
We definitely should do that. So, and there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So definitely use this opportunity to jot down your question. Maybe I can kick things off with my own. I mean, really great presentations, and yeah, just kind of like seems like every turn of the slide was like an inspiring moment of and just trying to think of the fictive space or yeah, just push a little bit on how viewers learned what these fictive spaces were, or thinking if there's how would a viewer recognize such a space, and is there something outside of religious practice that would shape how they would learn them? So I mean, it's very common to maybe use like a meditation text or like a Buddhist text to try to interpret what a Buddhist image is. You know, Michael, your paper is great where you have like Taoism and Buddhism, right? This is kind of, there are multiple traditions or multiple kinds of people that would be interacting with these images. So yeah, how does a person know when know a fictive space when they see one? And is there is someone outside of art history? Is that well established that there's a kind of non-Buddhist fictive space that people would recognize, or there's already like a culture of fictive spaces that are created visually that the Buddhist artists are tapping into? That makes sense.
Michael, do you want to take that first, since it's sort of pointed
yeah, I can. So the mechanism how one would know. Well, I mean, part of what my initial response to the question is I think when we think about how we imagine what a surface can do, we look for surfaces that show something back to us. And so it's a later example. Well, I mean, in terms of its prominence in visual culture, but the text is circulating of visualizations of Amitabha's Pure Land start with thinking about things like water. Again, Anne Fung, shout out to her work on that. Water naturally reflects something. Mirrors too also offer us a reflection. And so there are lots of different mundane ways actually that I think different types of surface can allow people to imagine, regardless of a religious context, what a surface can do. Stones, we know they would have also been polished, and so they would have had a kind of luminescent quality or reflective quality to it. And I think that those more conventional material affordances give you, this is me riffing a little bit, enough of a kind of imaginative spark to imagine the potential for what that surface can do just beyond being something that's flat. I will say, at least with respect to my materials, the way the additional transformation Buddhas actually appear in the caves is they actually probably come after the central icon is finished, and they're later generations of donors who go back, and it's as if the central image demands that these things happen. So it points, I think, almost to the fact that the awareness of what these objects are capable of doing is so pervasive that an encounter with the main icon in Cave 18 naturally invites a reaction where the imaginative capacity for stone to be luminous, and at least in this case transparent, makes the move to create more transformation Buddhas a given. They're just like, yeah, this is of course what we would do here. The monument demands it of us. I don't know if I've totally answered the question about how we imagine reflective space, but those are some of my initial thoughts.
Can I take that a
Yeah,
little
Kate,
further?
please jump in. Yeah.
So I think it's a really good question to ask, like, how do people learn to read visual images, right? And I think I'm glad you asked it, because I think, I've been, at least in this work, I've been sort of proposing that one of the things that we're seeing is the process by which artists and artisans are wrestling with some fundamental representational problems that are presented by Buddhism, and I don't want to say they didn't exist before. It's not like there's not a pretty rich visual tradition that preexists, that predates this, but still, I think there are some challenges, and it's kind of fun to see them be wrestled with. There's a great little, wonderful little kind of gilt bronze Buddha quite early from China, probably like late 4th, early 5th century. And he's got, instead of having a halo, he's got just flames coming off his shoulders. And it's kind of, you can just kind of see the artist going, okay, well, so what is a halo again, right? Light coming from the neck. Okay, let's see. And just coming up with this as a visual solution. But you're right. I mean, people have to learn how to look at things and how to understand what they're seeing. Otherwise we art historians would be out of a job. So it's not necessarily a natural process. And so I think that Buddhism is a really interesting place to expand this idea of the transparent stone, precisely because Buddhist images were much more accessible to a friend of mine called your average Joe, right? You're kind of, to public view than funerary images were, right? So there's a lot of two-dimensional. So of course there are paintings on silk and paper that we know must have existed but don't survive, up until, some of the earliest surviving ones are kind of, with a few like Warring States exceptions, they're mostly post-Han. But what we have that survives is kind of like mural paintings on the walls of tombs and decorated coffins and things like this. And these are all things which are presumably on display in the context of a funeral ceremony, but then get kind of walled up in the tomb, and really quite explicitly walled up. There's sort of a famous tomb called at a site called Tangshan in Shandong, which basically, Jiangsu, wherever it is. Anyway, it has an inscription which basically says, addresses itself to the deceased and says, look at how great this tomb is that we built for you. Now don't come back. So it's in Buddhism. I think one of the things that Buddhism does is that it makes everyday people's lives much more image saturated than they once were. Right, because there's just images everywhere. So I think, I'm not sure it really answers your question, but I think that the proliferation of images is part of a kind of developing culture of perception, if that makes any sense. That is also happening in this same time period. So
yeah, I'm just especially curious if there are ways to use like a text outside of Buddhism to figure out like a you know how even just the idea, I mean, you mentioned like tombs or I guess in some ways those are transformational spaces where maybe you're creating the tomb as a kind of other world, but it's a special liminal place, right? A more public place. At least to my knowledge, there aren't a lot of, yeah, you said fictive spaces. I think like maybe even transformational spaces, just spaces that become something else when the image is there, right? You're looking at an image, but it's really making the space almost like a portal or something.
yeah, contemporary tomb murals from this very same period really are constructing the interior of the tomb as a kind of space depicting, you know, what you want your afterlife to be. Usually involves like a lot of really good food and some nice clothes. But yeah, I mean, the idea, I think the whole idea that images on a surface can transform the nature of the space that they adorn is a shared idea between funerary art and Buddhist art. And I mean, honestly, I think there's a number of places where these two kinds of imagery really ought to be considered together. I think tomb portraits and donor portraits is another place where they should overlap. So I think you're right. Like the idea that that a two-dimensional representation is a kind of window into a world, and that the artist can make the world into whatever they want. I think that's being done in a lot of places at this point in the 6th century.
Super fascinating. Ooh, I see a question and answer. Maybe I would read this from Elisa Beer. How often would people have been looking at the images alone versus in the company of others? As a European medievalist, I'm reminded of the presumed didactic purpose of cathedral stained glass and the ways in which we assume they were used to illustrate orally transmitted religious text.
You want, well, okay.
Yeah, we can trade off who starts.
Okay, I'll start this one. And as Elisa knows, I do also teach medieval European art, so this is kind of an interesting one because I'm actually often giving my students a hard time and saying like, are we really sure that the stained glass windows are intended to illustrate texts? The problem with stained glass windows, of course, is that they're like 30 feet off the ground, and how much can you really see? But, you know, to be perfectly honest, that's also true of a number of the images on the walls of large-scale cave temples. And I don't know if you got the impression from Michael's photographs, but these the figures that he's showing us are monumental. They're, you know, tens of meters high, and you walk in and kind of look up, and how much can you really see? So that question of what is the purpose of an image that isn't clearly visible is a related one. But anyway, to answer the question you actually asked, we think that a lot of these cave temple sites were effectively open to the public. At least there's nowhere any kind of recorded. Nobody ever makes a comment like, oh, well, you know, only the friends of the family are allowed into that cave, right? In other words, they seem to have been open to the public in the same way that a Buddhist temple would have been. And that descriptions of what happens at Buddhist temples are present in a number of texts, including the Luoyang Qielanji, the record of monasteries at Luoyang, which Michael also quoted from, didn't you? You had a quote from.
Yes, yeah.
Like, I think I remember, which describes some of the activities that happened in and around temples. And it includes stuff like, you know, festivals, people come in large numbers to make offerings on particular holidays. There's some of it reads a lot like, I don't know, I went to college in Boston, and there were like these Italian Saints' Day festivals where they bring the saint out and parade it around the streets, and there's like a hot dog cart, and like in the case of early medieval China, right, they're describing kind of what do you call it, acrobats and musicians, and there would be a bounce house, except it's the 6th century, right? So in other words, there's actually quite a lot of sort of community activity that seems to revolve around this. And in addition, when we have donor inscriptions, they often record, or the donor inscription on a Buddhist monument will often record that the people who pulled their money to build this monument also did a bunch of other stuff, including like we threw a vegetarian feast for the poor, right? That's a thing that's going to happen, right? So that's a long-winded way of saying we expect there to be quite a lot of community activity surrounding sort of happening in and around the institutions in which a lot of these monuments were installed, so cave temples or temples. And it seems likely that that your local temple might be a part of your community in the same way that your local parish church would be in a more modern context. So yeah, I think it probably was the case that people were looking at them together. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, especially with the site that I introduced, that is a giant, massive public outward-facing monument that I don't know that it would ever have been something that someone could have truly participated with as an individual. I mean, the statues are 50 feet tall. The spaces kind of envelop you, and they're meant for this, I think, very much an outward-facing kind of messaging. Yeah, that can be scaled down to smaller shrines, but even those, as far as we can tell, are always communal endeavors. So you have various religious societies that gather around monument creation and image creation. So even if it's a single family, that family is composed of multiple people. If not, it's going to be multiple members of the community coming together. So not just the participation with the monuments, the creation of these sites is also, I think, a communal act that would have existed within the kind of calendar of early medieval life in China. I know there's one site with what is it, Bingzhou. So it's also northeast China. That's a 5th, 6th century site. Yeah. Where that the group of statues that have been covered there, not only do they have donor inscriptions on them, but they also are made at different frequencies with specific dates in mind. And so we see sculpture production from that example as being something, or artistic production as something that is woven into one's measure of the year. And so again, we get a communal act that's enacted over time at different occasions that becomes, again, sort of imbricated, I think, pretty closely with the life of any given community. Yeah.
And to add to that, thinking about stained glass windows, collective donations, as Michael said, are really common, and that it might be there's sometimes what's called a village society, so 义社, which may well in fact be all the members of a or most of the members of a village, and so on, that pool their money to donate an image. One thing we don't have in the 6th century, as far as I know, is guild donations, but that actually comes along in like the 8th century. There's a dyers guild hall at Longmen. This is another cave temple site that is from the Tang. And so it's not too long after the material that Michael and I have been talking about that you do start to get even kind of other kinds of community organizations also involved in the donation, right, in the sponsorship of these images. And if in the sponsorship, I think also in the consumption, as it were, right, like the making offerings to images and praying in front of images and so on. So I think those things are kind of all of a piece, and do provide. I mean, there's a reason my minor field is medieval Europe, right? Like there are some really useful analogies to be made to the medieval context.
We have anonymous contribution. How viewers' movement in and around and interaction with cave and stela may change their understanding of the sacred space or sites.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think for my site, certainly scale is something that I'm excited to go back this summer, because when I first visited, the Yungan grottos, I was not thinking that about them academically. I was just sort of there as a tourist. But even with it, out kind of approaching them with a more kind of traditional academic mindset, um, you are the space asks you to do nothing but behold in a very kind of deep, powerful way, where regardless of one's own religious affiliation, at least when you're building at the scale that the Tanyao caves are, um, they charge the monument with the power to um, demand your attention and for you to sort of behold divinity in sort of its grandest sense. Um, and you see, I think that operates in different ways when you shrink down the size of a cave shrine, but the space absolutely, I think, conditions how you are interacting with these icons and perceiving them.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that in that and one thing that you notice if you visit some of the slightly later caves at Yungang, the big kind of central pillar caves that are in the paired caves, you know, is how absolutely, so there are these huge spaces, and they're absolutely densely, completely overwhelmingly filled with imagery. And and comparing this to the scale of the human body, right? As a human being, you kind of move into this space and you are just completely enveloped in kind of spatial input overload, if that makes any sense. They're not necessarily It's not necessarily like a VR experience where there's sort of a coherent path that you take through. Sometimes there is, but most of the time it's just here are a bunch of Buddhas. This is right here are some things that that are overwhelming. I think and so you are completely enveloped in this kind of pictorial program. I think it's a little different when it comes to stele and small scale sculptures, but I think we absolutely should and can ask the same questions. So something I'm always asking students to consider is, you know, how do you relate with this to this artwork in terms of kind of the scale of the human body? And some of the steles are sort of human sized, if you will, kind of like a standing stone pillar or something like that. So you can kind of walk around them. You can see all the different sizes. Um, they can also be visually complex and overwhelming. I mean, the one I showed today is actually quite small, but it still has a lot going on. And crucially, one of the interesting things about those tablet-shaped stele is that they often kind of feel like if you could just kind of peel off the surface and evert it, you would get a cave temple, right? Like, so the cave temples they often, you enter, there's a main Buddha in the back, on the back wall, there's sort of stuff going on around the sides, there's sort of less important stuff in the back, and it's almost there's a sort of an analogy to be drawn between that and the four surfaces of a stele. It's just are you inside it or are you outside it? So that's another question that I've thought about for a long time, but I haven't been able to really work into my research in a useful way. But there are some. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't want to jump in, or I mean, I do want to jump in, but I didn't want to interrupt your thought.
Well, I'll just say that there are Buddha statues happen at many different scales, and particularly some of the kind of gilt bronze ones are often they're like little pocket Buddhas. They're portable. So I think that I think we should always think about the interaction between the human viewer and the image, but I think it is going to be different based on scale and based on material. So go ahead, Michael.
Just adding to that ever so slightly, I do agree that as you get smaller, maybe you develop a kind of slightly different personal relationship with the object or the stele or the votive sculpture. But at the same time, the examples you showed today, Kate, I was so struck by that even though they are fixed in terms of their actual physical volume, because of this imagined ability of stone to do more spatially, they end up acting beyond the limits of their own physical scale, if that makes sense. So I still feel like this thing that you're noticing about you know, a surface that can kind of be punched through is it's visual as much as it is spatial. So even that scene with Manjushri and Bimalakirti, part of that whole scene is imagining that basically the entire cosmic entourage of the Buddha can fit into a tiny hut or tiny house. And so there's even a way that something like that is, I think, kind of pointing to the way in which stone as a surface can be an expanded field, and it does that because perhaps maybe on the other side it is inflatable, if you will, which is maybe not quite the same thing as transparency, but it's still a kind of another imagined material affordance of something that's otherwise you can't stretch stone, you can't easily you can't make it into sheets, it's not malleable, it's not ductile, you can't turn it into a wire, but you can add carvings that give it a different spatial dimension, which I do wonder now, kind of thinking aloud and then thinking about the materials you introduced, if that actually isn't somehow kind of part of this larger discussion about the ways in which Buddhists are can imagine ways to transcend materiality.
I think
that makes sense.
Oh, okay. I was going to riff on that some more, but Elisa has another question. You ask good questions, Elisa.
So we have might the fact that transforming images appear only in the textile folds of the Buddha statue from Cave 18 perhaps be linked to an attempt to problematize the solid nature of stone by transforming the fabric specifically, since fabric is a fundamentally less permanent material than stone. Using the stone fabric as a kind of representational bridge into the impermanence and transformation being depicted.
Okay, you know why that's a good question? All right, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, no. I mean, the one, I haven't been thinking about the materiality of text, or wait, no, what's the logical relationship here? Because we've taken stone, imagined it as a textile, but textiles have a different material property than stone. So I think the rhetorical function of framing that as a kind of material bridge is an interesting one that I kind of have to double check the archaeological report. The only thing that maybe problematizes a little bit is that I can't remember if at the top they're very poorly photographed because they're hard to get to, if they might not have tiny forms on the body itself. So this is again where the sculpture gets a little ambiguous, but Kate, maybe you.
Well, what that makes me think about is the cosmic Vairochana, which is a thing that comes along again in the 6th century rather than the 5th century mostly. So this is a form of Buddha sculpture, like a standing, imagine if you will, a standing Buddha wearing a robe as the Buddha so often does. And on the robe appear the 6 different levels of rebirth and some kind of cosmological information. Or cosmological diagrams, basically an image of the cosmos. So the underworld, this world, the heavens of the Buddhas, the 6 forms of rebirth, and so on. And they do appear on the Buddha's garment, which I think might be another basically data point to suggest that, yeah, maybe the textile is kind of a mediating metaphor to enable these things to manifest themselves. At the same time, it is also worth pointing out that Chinese art, considered broadly, is not an art tradition in which the nude body is itself a kind of aesthetic subject. So it's kind of hard to imagine how you would depict the manifestation of miraculous Buddhas, which are like, it's like a response of the universe to the presence of true enlightenment is kind of why these Buddhas appear, right? Like, here's enlightenment and things Buddhas just like pop into existence. It's hard to imagine that being represented on the physical body in the absence of a tradition, an art tradition that really explores the representation of the unclothed body. So I'm not sure where to take that. I think it's a really interesting and important question.
Can I add like a 2-second like piggyback off of that? Is
go for it.
Because I think I've been looking at some of these images recently, and they do something similar where some of the mural examples will show the outline of the body through the garment with some of the forms on the body and some of them not. So I think it speaks specifically to Kate, what you're talking about is how Chinese visual culture doesn't have a tradition of the nude, and yet the inspiration for some of these images would have maybe like to have leveraged a nude, if you will, to sort of support their iconographic forms. The one thing that I still don't quite know what to make of it, and so it's a question for another time, is that these sets of images, the one thing where they blur this line between the nude of the Buddha's body itself and the projection onto the garment is that a lot of them have a horse represented frontally at the Buddha's groin, which
right.
part of me wonders if it's not a very a visual rebus referencing what in Chinese is referred to as the sort of hidden horse mark. It's a reference to the Buddha, one of the marks of the Buddha's body, and so the images do struggle with this kind of question of where does body and garment start and stop, and where do the material properties start and stop. And I think Buddhist art makers seem to be fine with living in that ambiguity. It helps to reject material fixity, but anyway, but just wanted to kind of piggyback off of the materials Kate just raised.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Michael and Kate for 2 excellent papers and great discussion, and to the audience members for some really great questions. Just a heads up that we have another webinar for the CCS webinar next week, Wednesday, Chinese capital markets and corporate finance. So you can couple today's talk with something quite different. We also have a 20th century history of Manchuria coming up very soon, as well as a webinar on entrepreneurship in China. So please join us again, and I will clap, but you can give your virtual clap on your reactions if you like. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.